Hello everybody and welcome back to Eastburn Models. On today's video I want to be going over how you thin and use Vallejo primers. Now I often hear people say that Vallejo primers are bad, which I definitely don't agree with. They are finicky to work with and get right. There are some primers out there, like Badger have one which is a nice primer, but I just like the Vallejos. That's why I keep using these. But all in all, you know, when I see people have bad experiences with Vallejo, even myself sometimes, it tends to be from some form of user error or lack of knowledge in regard these primers and what thinners to use. Because everybody's trying to save money and thin these primers down with, say, windscreen wash and stuff like that and water. I've done that before and I don't like the finish on them. It's not solid enough for me. That's why I always go for the Tamiya Colour acrylic paint thinner, the X20A. I always use that. I don't use any other, because the primer is the first thing you put down on your models or anything like that, and then your paint goes on top. Now if you ain't got a solid primer, well then there's no point painting it because it's just going to come back off. How I managed that problem when I had issues when I first started using this, I had to change the way I was airbrushing. You need to use thin coats, and by thin I mean thin. This might sound stupid and a bit ignorant, but I had to consider that when I class something as a thin coat, it actually wasn't thin. Because if it's too thick, this stuff will come off easy. And if it's too thin, it'll come off easy as well. So that's all down to how you mix your primers, if you've got too much thinner to paint ratio, it's not going to cover, it's not going to stick. So what I did is I turned to using 3 coats of thin layers. Then after each layer I put it under the flasher, which is on my right here, which I have done a video on the flasher, and it just blows room temperature air onto the item. So today we'll be using these spoons, so I just spray it and then put it on the flasher, let the breeze on it a couple of seconds or so, 10-20 seconds, and then I can go back and give it another thin coat. Because the first coat you put on, you're not after coverage, you just have to get something on the model, or the spoon in this case, something for it to key to. Now these spoons are shiny when before they're primered, so if you start layering that really thick, it is going to chip. It's too smooth, there's nothing for it to get to. But if you put it on in thin coats, then you're putting it on so thin that it builds up over time. That's the trick with airbrushing. It's not like a spray can where you push the trigger down, say on one of these, you know, oops, I broke it. You push the triggers down on these, and it just I can't find it now, but it just throws it out when you do that. But you're supposed to still put these on, but because of the force it comes out pretty thick, and people tend to not have any bit of patience when it comes to thin coats, because they think, well, I've got to put 6 or 7 on. The problem you've got is if you try and do too much at once, it will destroy everything you've got. Because like I said, the base coat is the key to it. It's not the top colour paint or anything, it's the base coat. If you get that solid, anything you put on top of that will stay on. It's a bit like these cost me around 15 to 16 pound per bottle. Now the actual paint that I will be using on my R38 model, the Nissan GTR, that cost nearly 30 or 40 pound just for a little bottle. So because I'm going for a midnight purple, so the last thing I want is to be putting this on thick, which is wrecking the base of what that my new paint's going to go on. Because your new paint, the colour you want that to be, your finish colour, not your priming colour, is going to be on top of the primer. So I want that solid. I'm not wasting 30 or 40 pound on some midnight purple for Nissan R34 GTR. I'm not wasting that money knowing I haven't put the primer right. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over how I thin these down and what needle I push these through. Now they do say on the Vallejos, on the Vallejo primers, that you can just put them straight through. Let's move this out of the way. That you can just put them straight through the airbrush. Now I don't like doing that with any paint. I really don't. I like to thinning it down, even if it's 2%, 3%, just enough so I get a better flow. I'll just put my brew down. As you can tell, I'm doing this all live now. So how I go about, I'm going to tell you, the gun I'm using is just a cheap gun that I got off eBay. It's only for primering. It's got a 0.3 needle into it, but it gives me the easier option just to pull the thing, because you tend to do more primering than you do actually top coat. So I tend to save the airbrushes, the good airbrushes what I've got, for just the top coats. I don't really fancy putting primers through these, you know, through them ones. So that's why I use this cheaper, and I think it was about £30 this one, £35. But I'm not bothered if it lasts me 6 months for what it is. But it does the job what I need it to do. So always have, a recommendation as well is always have an airbrush that you've got airbrushes, because I have a number of airbrushes that I keep for with different needles in for the finish paint. I don't put primers through them at all. I like to keep this one as a primer, a primering gun. But what we'll do now is we'll go through and we'll use the black first, and I will show how I thinning it down with the Tamiya. So I've got the exact same Tamiya X28 in this bottle here. It just makes it easier because I can alter the top for how much comes out of it, that's all, instead of trying to pour that into everything. It's just makes a mess. Right, so we've got as Tamiya thinner, we've got as Vallejo, we've give that a good shake, make sure there's nothing that's stuck or anything like that. Right, I always work on, when it comes to primers, because I'm putting them down thick, thin anyway, that I do like a nice flow out of the brush, the airbrush. And what I do is I normally put at least 50-50 mix in. So I'll just use other hands so you can see. So if I put that much in, just because we're only testing it, because with these little sample jars I've got, whatever's left, I just put the lid on, the sealable and everything, I can just keep it. It's absolutely fine. I do have some made up here already, but for the video I wanted to show just what I'm doing. So with a little bit of primer. Right, so now we know it's about there. If I just get a little stick, it's about there. So I need to put about there in. So you tend to do it by eye, you kind of get to know. So if I just grab that, you just won't be able to tell really in here because of the black. Right, so I've done that now. So now I can put the lid onto this and then just give it a shake. And you just give it a nice shake, make sure you get all the paint from around it. Don't just give it a shake for a couple of seconds and think that's it, because what happens is the paint that was stuck to the sides will start thinning down, but then it'll alter the consistency. So you do need to make sure you give it a good shake to get that mixture of the thinner into the paint. So now we know that that's perfect now for what we do. We've done practically a 50-50 mix. So what we'll do, we'll flick the booth on, We'll flick the flashing machine on because we're going to need that. Okay, so we've got a spoon. So we've cleaned. Now, what I do with all my plastic spoons and my models and everything like that is, when I get them, I always put them through the ultrasonic cleaner, just using just normal water, not tap water. I use battery water, deionized water I think it's called, I'm not too sure. I just know where it is to get it. And there's no chemicals in it, because obviously something from your tap that the supplier supplies you has got chemicals in to kill any bacteria or anything like that, any corrosion in the pipework that they've got to pump it to you. So you don't want any of that. So I put them through the ultrasonic cleaner for about 20 minutes. Then I put them through my dehydrator to dry off for about 20 minutes. So I know when I get them, there's no grease on them from factory mouldings or anything like that. So that's like another key you've got to remember. Always wash the item you're spraying. You need to give it a good scrub. I don't like washing up liquid. I don't like that. A lot of modelers will say use a toothbrush and washing up liquid. The problem is washing up liquid's a grease. So if you don't actually get it off, it dries on there, then you come to put your paint on and it just peels back off or chips back off. So I like to just use the battery water because there's nothing in it. I don't want no chemicals in it and nothing. So, but I have done a video on the ultrasonic cleaner and the dehydrator, so please check that out to know how I do everything before I get to this stage. Okay, so what we'll do now, we'll get his airline. I'm actually running at about 15-16 psi. So you don't need to crank it up to 20-30. You don't need to, because it's thin paint. Because that's all we want to put on is thin paint. So we now know we've got a shake. We now know it's been shaked. It's down to here now. I can see that even now when you look at this, you know what colour it's going to leave on. That's why I like these test tubes, because you know what colour it's going to actually leave on if you know it's too thin or thick, because you can see it as it's running down, so it leaves the black colour. If it starts going clear when you stand it back up that way, it's too thin. You need to add more paint. You need to make sure that when you've tipped it and it's gone back down, it's still got its colour, but enough to run. Don't put it too thick. So what we'll do, we'll put the black in there, and these just wash out with water. It's not a problem at all. What I tend to do is just put a bit of Tamiya thinner into it. Oh no, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put windscreen wash. Just put it half full with. I'll just use normal windscreen wash just to clean the airbrushes out, because it's acrylic and it's got some kind of agent in it to get rid of the grease off your windscreens and stuff like that. And there you go, look, it's clean again now. It's just bubbles. So it is a nice paint to use once you get the hang of it, and to clean. Like now, as you can tell, it's gone clear again now. So that's just with windscreen wash, because you don't want to keep washing your stuff out with the thinner, because this ain't cheap stuff. I think I paid about £9 for 2 of these, so they're only 250ml each. So I just prefer just to use the screen wash, because I can get 5 litres of that for about £3 or £4. So we'll put that there just while we're testing this. And yep, you don't want to set it so it's coming out absolutely thick. You just want a mist. That's all you're going for, and that's why I have this paper down, so I can just spray onto it and see what coverage I'm getting. Okay, so we're back. What we're going to do now, again, it's been cleaned off, it's gone through the ultrasonic cleaner, then the dehydrator, so I know my box of spoons here has all gone through. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the first coat on really light. You don't want to overload it, you're not going for coverage. So all we're doing is misting it on, that's it. I don't know if you can just see that on the camera. I think you can. You can still see the white behind it. And we just put that under the flasher. The thinner the coats, it dries within seconds under flashers. It'll dry just out here. Just blow on it with airbrush or something, but I don't like doing that just in case. I don't like getting into the habit of using the airbrush to blow some fresh air onto it from compressor, because one day I'm going to be, if say I use my 40 or 50 pound paint and I do that and I'm on my last coat and it spits because I pulled trigger too much or it breaks, I've wrecked the paint job. So that's why I built my own little flashing system just from an old computer fan. Right, so it's now dry. So we go again, just a little bit slower. That's all we're covering. It's getting darker. So, and you'll just let it flash off. Don't be tempted to keep putting this paint on while the previous paint is wet, because in essence what you're doing is you're putting a thick coat on. You're not giving it chance to dry and key to the surface. That's a lot of people's mistake. Well, it's one of them anyway. They think because it's been under flasher, you'll know when it's dried because it'll go dull. So if you turn it into light, you can see a shiny spot. This is a matte paint, it's a matte primer. So if it's got a shine on it, then apart from the actual glare of the light, you can always tell when something's wet. If it's got a shine on it, like a wet shine, you need to dry it even more. So now we've got that, so we'll just keep going and go a little bit slower. And again, just a little bit thicker, not too much. And again, we're getting more coverage now. It looks a bit grey on the camera, but we'll put that under the flasher. But like I said, the key is thin coats. I thinned the paint down, the primers down, practically 50%, because I do like how it flows out. I want a thin coat. I don't want a thick coat. Like I said, there's no point primering if you're going to throw it on, expect it to stay on, then put your paint on top and then wonder why your models are chipping off or they get damaged. It flakes off because you never did the fundamentals of it. That's why I say it's normally, when this stuff goes wrong, it's normally user error and just lack of understanding how to use it, because every primer is different. Like I say, the Badger primers work completely different and a lot of people love them. That I've used them myself, they're nice primers, but I like the Vallejos just the same. So I tend to use what I know is going to work because I know how to use it. Right, so again, it's dry. So we'll go over again. This time, just a little bit heavier coat, but yeah, I don't mean heavy, I mean go slower. Don't crank this valve up to push more paint at once. You just go slow with your airbrush. And because we've actually gone in with very thin coats, as you can tell, that's what I mean about the wet look. You can always tell if it's got a wet look to a matte look. So, because we've gone in with thin coats, you can go a little bit slower because the new coat has got something to hold to. And that's why we do it in thin coats, but a lot of people, they tend not to have the patience. I didn't when I first airbrushed. I thought, no, 1 or 2 coats, I want it done. But I found that everything was just going wrong, not just with the Vallejos, with any paint I put through the airbrush. And at one point I thought, this isn't for me, this airbrushing. And then I just sat there and I learned about it. I watched other people's videos and listened to how they do it, because I can only go off, I can only show you what I do because I know it works. If somebody else does this and they say it doesn't work, then clearly there's something wrong. It's either they haven't thinned it down correctly, or they haven't cleaned the item, like the spoons that they have, or the model. They haven't cleaned it enough, they've still got grease on it, or they've just put too thick a coat on, because clearly it works, because I do it all the time. So as you can tell from here, you can still see a bit of shine there, but then it goes flat. That's what I mean about a wet look. If that is still wet when you're putting your next coat onto the primer, all you're doing is you're just putting it on thick. You need to let that get like that. Once it's like that, your next coat will lay down nicely. If it's like that, it will dry and it'll look covered, but it won't last 2 minutes. As soon as we bend that spoon, it's gonna come back off again. So just be patient with it. Even if it means you have to leave it under the flasher for a little bit longer, just have patience and leave it under the flasher. I'm not worried. The flasher is not a heater, so it's not supping electricity. It's a 12 volt fan out of a PC that I was going to throw away, but I found the use for the fan itself. So I just put a 12 volt adapter onto it, so it's not costing anything. I can run this thing from a USB. So, but we just leave it there till it dries off. We need it to dry off. And that's why this video, I'm not really doing it at the moment, because I want it to dry off. Plus I can't go to the grey primer because the black's in the gun. Right, so as you can tell, it's gone. So, touch it, just with the back of your finger. Don't get me wrong, if you put your thumb on it and then drag it, it's going to still move, because just because the top, it's just shelled off, it's flashed off. That's all. That's why I call mine the flasher. Underneath will still be wet. So now we can go in for this final coat, and I don't know how many coats we've put onto this one, but it don't bother me. I'm not doing nothing. I'd rather make that solid so I can get my colour onto it. So we'll just go in a little bit slower now, put a bit more of a wetter coat on, but that'll come naturally anyway because you're moving a lot slower. So as you can tell now, we've got a nice black spoon, because that's what it started like, and now it's gone like that. So what we'll do, we'll put that under the flasher now, let that completely flash off, because as you can see it's wet, so we need it to go completely matte, and then I'll go and clean the gun out, and then we'll come back and we'll have a look at the grey as well.